Samantha had never expected much from her job as a cleaner at the grand estate of billionaire investor William Kincaid. The mansion was luxurious, but for the most part, she kept her head down, cleaning the polished floors, dusting the towering shelves, and attending to the ever-expanding piles of laundry. Her life was simple, working long hours to provide for her 2 kids, keeping the bills paid, and making sure they had a roof over their heads. She didn't expect to become a part of the billionaire's world, or even be noticed. Mr. Kincaid, a frail man in his late 70s, was rarely seen in public, and when he was, it was only for short, scheduled meetings with his attorneys or doctors. Despite his fortune, there was an air of isolation around him, a man buried in his wealth, but far from happiness. On that particular morning, Samantha was on her usual routine, scrubbing the marble floors in the grand foyer of the mansion. The sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting soft golden light on the antique furniture that filled the space. As she worked, she heard the faint shuffle of slippers behind her, and she turned to see Mr. Kincaid standing by the grand staircase, watching her. She hadn't expected him to be out of bed, let alone standing in the middle of the room. His face, as always, was a mask of stoic indifference. But today, something felt different. There was a weight in the air, something unspoken that Samantha couldn't quite place. "Good morning, Mr. Kincaid," she greeted him politely, trying to mask the nervousness she always felt around him. He was, after all, a billionaire. She was just a cleaner. But today, he didn't answer her greeting right away. He simply stood there, eyes slightly narrowed, as if deep in thought. After a long, uncomfortable silence, he finally spoke. "Samantha," he said, his voice raspy and quiet, "I need to ask something of you, something rather unconventional." Samantha froze, unsure of where this was going. Her mind raced through possibilities, but none of them seemed to make sense. She was just a cleaner. What could a man like him possibly need from her? But her curiosity was piqued, and she stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. "I'm dying," he said bluntly, his eyes searching hers for a reaction. "You've probably heard. I don't have much time left." Samantha, always the professional, simply nodded, though a pang of discomfort ran through her. She had heard the rumors of his illness. He'd been battling a rare form of cancer for over a year. Though no one knew the exact details, most people were too afraid to ask or care. She felt a flicker of sympathy, but she quickly brushed it aside. "But I need you to do something for me," he continued, his voice softening. "I don't have family. No one left who cares about me in the way I need. I want you to be my wife. For a day." Samantha blinked in disbelief, convinced she had misheard him. She stood up straight, her heart pounding in her chest. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice quivering slightly. He repeated the request, his words slow and deliberate, as if trying to gauge her reaction. "Marry me. For a day. It's not what you think. I don't want anything romantic. I just need someone to stand by my side, to experience what it feels like to be loved, to be cared for, even just for one day. You see, I've never had that. I've spent my entire life focused on wealth, on power, and now, with only months left to live, I realize I've never truly been seen. Not for who I am. I want to feel what it's like to have someone who truly cares, even if it's just for a fleeting moment." Samantha felt a mix of emotions swirl inside her: confusion, discomfort, and a strange sense of sympathy for the man who stood before her, so vulnerable in his request. She had never thought about Mr. Kincaid as anything more than the distant, wealthy employer. She had heard the stories of his fortune and his reputation as a ruthless businessman, but here he was, asking something deeply human from her. Her mind raced. Why her? Why did he choose her of all people to fulfill such an intimate, life-altering request? Samantha tried to process it. She wasn't even sure if she could say no to someone like him. What if this was her chance to make a difference in someone's life? What if he was asking for something that would change her own life in ways she couldn't yet imagine? But she was also a mother A single mother who couldn't afford to lose her job. She had bills to pay, children to care for. What would they think if they knew their mother had been asked to marry a billionaire for a day? It felt absurd, and yet there was something undeniably compelling about his request. Something about the way he looked at her, vulnerable yet desperate, made her feel as though she couldn't refuse. "Mr. Kincaid," she began, her voice trembling as she tried to find the right words. I don't know what to say. This is a huge request. I'm just a cleaner. You don't know me." He nodded, the faintest trace of sadness crossing his face. "I know, but I trust you. You've always been kind to me, and I've never forgotten that. Please, Samantha, just for one day, a day when I can feel like I matter." The silence between them stretched out, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. Samantha felt her pulse quicken as she realized that this wasn't just an unusual request. It was a turning point in her life, a crossroads that she couldn't ignore. There was something powerful in what he was asking her to do, something that might give her the opportunity to see life from a perspective she never thought possible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Samantha spoke. "I'll do it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll marry you. For a day." The words hung in the air like a promise, and she immediately regretted saying them. But it was too late. She had agreed. And now her life was about to change forever. The days that followed were a blur of preparation, a whirlwind that left Samantha feeling disoriented and unsure of what she had gotten herself into. The reality of her decision settled in with each passing hour, and despite her resolve, she couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief. How could she, a simple cleaner, be caught up in something so unimaginable? The offer from Mr. Kincaid was far beyond anything she had ever imagined. She had spent the better part of the past few days trying to ignore the weight of what was to come, focusing instead on the tasks at hand: cleaning, cooking, organizing. But the moment she had agreed to marry him for a day, her life had shifted. The first time she saw him after her acceptance, Mr. Kincaid seemed even more fragile than she remembered. His health had deteriorated rapidly over the past few months. His once towering, commanding presence had diminished, and now he looked like a man who had been worn down by life, by choices he couldn't undo and regrets that had built up like an insurmountable wall. His usual stiff demeanor had softened, his face now showing the marks of someone who had lived a life of solitude. His once sharp eyes now seemed tired, distant, and tinged with a sadness that had no outlet. The day arrived, and it was nothing like Samantha had expected. The grand estate, already a symbol of opulence and excess, was transformed for the occasion. Flowers, candles, and white linens covered every surface in the enormous dining room. There was no ceremony, no traditional vows, just a simple, understated gathering between two people who had barely known each other, but were about to make a promise that would change everything. Samantha stood at the entrance of the room, her nerves threatening to take over, as she looked at the man who had requested her to play this unimaginable role in his life. She was dressed in a simple but elegant gown, more than she had ever dreamed she could afford, but it wasn't the dress that made her feel out of place. It was the reality of what was happening. She wasn't a bride, not in the way anyone would expect. She wasn't marrying for love or even companionship. She was marrying for something more fleeting and, in many ways, more tragic. Mr. Kincaid, still in his sickly state, stood waiting for her at the other end of the room, looking much smaller than his years had made him. His once impeccable suit was now slightly disheveled, his tie loosened, and his hand shook ever so slightly. There was no fanfare, no crowd of well-wishers, just the two of them in this opulent room, surrounded by the silent weight of unspoken words and emotions that neither of them knew how to voice. Samantha walked toward him slowly, unsure of what to expect. Was she meant to play the part of a wife, to comfort him as he faced the end of his life? Or was this something more symbolic, something he needed to prove to himself before it was all over? Her heart ached for him. She had always known he was lonely, but she had never truly understood the depths of that loneliness. Now, As she stood before him, ready to fulfill his request, she saw how deeply it had shaped his life. "I never thought I would be here, doing this," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the grand room. "But I'll be here. I'll stand by you." She didn't know why she said those words, why she felt the need to say them, but they felt like the only thing she could offer him. He smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming with a mix of gratitude and something else, something Samantha couldn't quite place. "Thank you," he whispered. "That's all I've ever wanted, to know what it felt like to have someone who cared, even if just for a day." The ceremony, if it could even be called that, was brief. There were no vows, no promises beyond the one they had already made to each other, no grand declarations of love. Instead, they simply shared a moment, a brief, fragile instant where two strangers found themselves bound by something deeper than either could fully comprehend. For Samantha, it was a strange feeling of responsibility, of bearing the weight of another person's life, a life that had been lived in isolation, now reduced to this final plea for connection. But it was in the moments that followed that the true cost of the day began to reveal itself. Mr. Kincaid's request had not just been about companionship. It was a plea for validation, for someone to see him as more than just a wealthy businessman or a man dying from illness. He wanted to feel like a human being again, to feel what it was like to be seen not for his money or his status, but for who he truly was, a man who had been forgotten by those who mattered most. And in that moment, Samantha felt an overwhelming wave of empathy for him. She had expected this day to be a formality, something she would endure in exchange for the temporary rewards that came with it. But instead, she found herself swept up in a complex web of emotions, caught between sympathy and confusion. After the brief ceremony, the two of them sat down at the long dining table, surrounded by the stillness of the mansion. There was no conversation at first, just silence, broken only by the occasional clink of silverware. As they ate, the weight of the situation continued to press in on Samantha. She could see Mr. Kincaid was growing weaker, his hands trembling as he took a sip from his glass. His once powerful presence had now become that of a frail, vulnerable man who had nothing left to hold on to but this fleeting day. Then came the first twist. A knock at the door interrupted their silence, and Samantha was startled when the butler entered with a message from one of Mr. Kincaid's associates. Samantha glanced at Kincaid, who had suddenly gone pale, his face tightening as if he had been expecting this. "What is it?" she asked softly, unsure whether she wanted to know the answer. Mr. Kincaid looked up, his voice barely a whisper. "It's someone from my past. Someone I thought I had left behind. I thought I was done with all of that." Samantha's heart raced. She had no idea what he was referring to, but the change in his demeanor was immediate. He seemed less like the frail old man before her and more like the businessman he had once been, someone with power, secrets, and a life far more complicated than she could ever understand. She realized, in that moment, that the man sitting across from her was not just the dying billionaire she had agreed to help. He was someone who had lived a life full of choices, regrets, and things better left in the past. As the butler left, leaving the room more tense than before, Samantha couldn't help but wonder, what had she really signed up for? What kind of man had she agreed to marry, even if only for a day? The unexpected presence of someone from Mr. Kincaid's past was just the beginning. The day, she soon realized, would be far more complicated than she had ever imagined. The arrival of the unexpected guest shattered the fragile calm that had settled over the room. Mr. Kincaid's reaction to the visitor's presence was immediate and alarming. His once steady gaze now flickered with a mix of discomfort and something darker, a shadow of fear that Samantha had never seen before. She sat there, her unease growing, as the butler left without a word, leaving her to wonder what kind of past could cause such a reaction in the usually composed billionaire. "I wasn't expecting him," Mr. Kincaid muttered under his breath, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for his glass. Samantha noticed the change in his demeanor, the way his normally cold exterior began to crack, revealing a man much smaller and more vulnerable than she had ever imagined. For the first time, she realized that perhaps this man, this powerful billionaire, wasn't the one in control. His illness had stripped him of that. And now, it seemed, his past was coming back to haunt him. Samantha shifted uneasily in her chair, unsure of what to say. She had never expected to find herself in such an awkward situation. She had agreed to play the role of his wife for a day. But this was something else entirely. The air felt thick with unspoken tension, and every glance between the two of them seemed to hold more weight than before. "Mr. Kincaid, who was that?" Samantha finally asked, her voice tentative. "Who's here? Is there something going on that I should know about?" Kincaid took a deep breath and looked at her, his eyes softening for a moment. "His name is Jonathan Crane. He's someone I hoped I would never see again." His voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. "Years ago, we were partners, business partners, but I made a decision that turned everything upside down. I betrayed him, Samantha, and now it looks like he's come to collect." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. She had never imagined that someone from Mr. Kincaid's past could be so impactful. She had seen the man as nothing more than a wealthy businessman, but now she was beginning to understand that there were layers to him that were darker and far more complicated than she had assumed. Before she could ask any more questions, the door swung open, and a man entered the room with a quiet confidence that made her feel uneasy. Jonathan Crane was tall, with sharp features and a cold, calculating stare. He dressed in dark, expensive clothes, and his presence was commanding, the complete opposite of Mr. Kincaid's frail and vulnerable state. His gaze quickly scanned the room before landing on Kincaid, and for a moment, the two men simply stared at each other in silence. "William," Crane said, his voice smooth but laced with venom, "I didn't expect to find you here, in this state. You certainly have a lot of nerve to call me after all these years." Mr. Kincaid straightened in his chair, but it was clear he wasn't as strong as he once was. "I didn't call you, Jonathan, but I knew eventually you'd come back for what you think is yours." Samantha watched in stunned silence as the tension between the two men grew thicker, as if the room itself could no longer contain the weight of their shared history. She felt like an outsider in this world of power, betrayal, and secrets, a world she had never wanted to be a part of, but now found herself thrust into. "You never could leave the past behind, could you?" Crane continued, his tone dripping with disdain. "You thought you could erase what you did, but nothing stays buried forever. And now, you want to use some charity case to feel good about yourself before you die." The words struck Samantha like a slap to the face. She had never considered the possibility that Mr. Kincaid's request for her to be his wife for a day could be seen as anything other than an innocent wish, a final plea for human connection before his time ran out. But now, with Jonathan Crane's words echoing in her mind, she started to wonder if there was more to this than she had ever realized. "Enough, Jonathan," Mr. Kincaid said, his voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and defiance. "I don't owe you anything anymore. What happened, happened. I've lived with the consequences, but you've never understood that. You've always been the one to pull strings, to manipulate people into doing your bidding. I'm not that man anymore." Crane's lips curled into a sneer, his eyes narrowing with contempt. "You think you can undo what's been done. You think your little show here will make up for everything. I don't care about your illness, William. I've come to claim what's mine." Samantha felt the weight of Crane's words settle over her like a dark cloud. It was becoming increasingly clear that Mr. Kincaid's request for her to be his wife wasn't some whimsical last wish. It was something much more calculated, a desperate attempt to redeem himself for a betrayal that had shattered not just one life, but many. She could feel the sudden gravity of the situation, a heaviness that pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. "What does he mean by claim what's mine?" Samantha asked, her voice shaking slightly as she turned to Mr. Kincaid. "What is this all about? Why does he think you owe him anything?" Kincaid's face grew pale, his hand trembling as he tried to steady himself. It's a long story, Samantha, but it's one I never wanted to tell. Jonathan and I were business partners, yes, but I betrayed him. I took something from him that he could never forgive. Crane's laugh was low and mocking. You don't even know what you've done, William. You think a day with a hired woman will absolve you of your sins. You've ruined everything, and now you're asking for forgiveness. It's too late for that. Samantha's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the story that were beginning to unfold. The man sitting before her was no longer just a billionaire with an odd request. He was a man with a past full of mistakes, regrets, and debts that he could never repay. And she was caught in the middle of it, trapped by circumstances she didn't fully understand, but now had no choice but to face. She stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. I don't know what this is all about, she said, her voice growing stronger. But I can't be a part of this. I agreed to marry you for a day, Mr. Kincaid. But I didn't agree to get caught in the middle of your past. I didn't agree to be a pawn in a game I don't even understand. Mr. Kincaid's eyes widened in shock, as if he had never considered that Samantha might refuse. But his gaze softened as he met her eyes. I'm sorry. I never wanted to drag you into this, but I don't have much time left. I didn't know what else to do. Crane's mocking smile faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation. You think this will end with you feeling good about yourself, William? Think again. You're not the man you used to be, and no amount of charity or last-minute apologies can change that. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time since agreeing to the arrangement, she felt a deep sense of clarity. She wasn't just here as a woman fulfilling a strange request. She was part of something far bigger, something she didn't fully understand but knew was dangerous. She didn't know if she could trust either of these men. But one thing was certain. She had just stepped into a world of betrayal, regret, and redemption, and she wasn't sure how it would all end. As Crane turned to leave, he shot one last contemptuous look at Samantha. You're a fool if you think this is over, William. It's only just begun. Samantha stood there, feeling the weight of his words settle over her like an impenetrable fog. This was no longer just a simple request. It was a test of morals, power, and most importantly, trust. And she wasn't sure how long she could stay in the middle of it all without being consumed by the fire that was quickly beginning to burn around them. The days following Jonathan Crane's visit were filled with an oppressive sense of uncertainty that settled like dust over the mansion. The events that had unfolded between Crane and Mr. Kincaid had left an indelible mark on Samantha. She had come into this arrangement with the intention of offering comfort to a man who seemed desperate for a connection in his final days. But now she was no longer sure if she had simply walked into a carefully orchestrated play of power and manipulation. The morning after Crane's visit, Samantha found herself pacing the halls of the mansion, unsure of her place in this world of wealth and deceit. Mr. Kincaid had retreated to his study, and the atmosphere in the mansion had shifted. There was a heaviness in the air, as though something terrible was about to happen. Despite her reservations, Samantha couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Mr. Kincaid wasn't the man he appeared to be. His illness and his plea for human connection were only part of the story. She had seen glimpses of a darker side, one that had been buried beneath the polished facade of the successful businessman. That afternoon, Mr. Kincaid called her to his study. He looked more fragile than ever, his face pale and drawn, and his once pristine suit hung loosely on his frail frame. As Samantha entered the room, she felt the weight of his gaze, as if he was scrutinizing her every move. She had never seen him like this before, vulnerable and desperate. His eyes were clouded with regret, but beneath that, there was something else, something that Samantha wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. "Samantha," he began, his voice hoarse, "I know you must have questions. You're probably wondering what Crane meant by claiming what's mine. I've been trying to protect you from all of this, but the truth is, it's already too late. You're involved now." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. She had been hoping for some clarity, some explanation to make sense of the chaos that had unfolded around her. But now she realized that she might have gotten more than she bargained for. She wasn't just a bystander in this twisted story. She was a part of it. "What do you mean, involved?" she asked, trying to steady her voice. "I don't want any part of whatever game you and Crane are playing. I agreed to be here for you, to help you. But I didn't sign up for this." Kincaid's eyes dropped to the floor, and for a moment, he seemed lost in thought. When he finally looked up at her, there was a flicker of something. Guilt, fear, perhaps even shame. "Crane was my partner years ago," he said slowly, "but that wasn't the real problem. The problem is what I did to him. You see, I didn't just betray him in business. I took something from him that no one should ever take. His family. His wife." Samantha felt the ground beneath her feet shift as the truth began to unravel before her. "You took his wife," she whispered, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what he was saying. Kincaid nodded, his face hardening. "I was young, ambitious. I thought I could have everything. Money, power, success. And I thought I could take anything I wanted. But I didn't realize the cost of it all. When I took his wife, it was more than just a betrayal. It was a life-altering decision that destroyed both our lives. Crane lost everything, his family, his dignity. And I gained nothing. I thought I could buy my way out of the consequences, but I was wrong." Samantha could feel the weight of his words settle over her like a heavy burden. She had known that Mr. Kincaid's life had been full of regrets, but she hadn't realized just how deep those regrets went. She had come to this mansion to fulfill a simple request, to help a man in his final days, but now she was entangled in a web of lies and deceit that went far beyond anything she had imagined. "The worst part," Kincaid continued, his voice barely a whisper, "is that I thought I could escape the past. But Crane was right. Nothing stays buried forever. He's come for me, and he won't stop until he gets what he thinks is owed to him." Samantha felt a pang of sympathy for him. She could see how much his past haunted him, how the choices he had made had led him to this point, alone, isolated, and desperate. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore the fact that he had dragged her into this mess. She wasn't sure what to do. She had no answers for him, no wisdom to offer. She had come here to play the role of a wife for a day, to provide him with the one thing he claimed to want: human connection. But now, she felt more like a pawn in a game that she didn't understand. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You've told me your story, but I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make things right for you, or for Crane." Kincaid leaned back in his chair, his hands shaking slightly as he clasped them in front of him. "I don't know if there is anything you can do, Samantha. I don't think there's anything anyone can do. The damage is done, and the consequences are coming. But I need you to understand something. This isn't just about me and Crane. This is about you too. You've stepped into a world that doesn't play by the rules you know. You've made a decision that will change your life, whether you realize it or not." Samantha felt her chest tighten as the realization hit her. This wasn't just a strange request from an elderly billionaire. This was a reckoning, a moment when the past could no longer be ignored, when the choices made years ago came crashing into the present, with no regard for the people caught in the middle. She had thought that by agreeing to marry him for a day, she could give him peace in his final moments. But now, it seemed that peace was something he would never find. The past had caught up with him, and it was going to claim its due, no matter the cost. As the day wore on, Samantha felt the weight of Mr. Kincaid's words lingering in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Jonathan Crane hadn't just come to collect a debt. He had come for revenge, and the twisted game they were playing was far from over. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, now felt like a cage. Samantha's role in this story had gone from that of a bystander to an active participant, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could stay in the middle of this storm. She had no way of knowing how things would unfold, but one thing was certain: her life had been irrevocably changed. And as the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows across the mansion. She couldn't help but wonder, how far was she willing to go to survive the consequences of Mr. Kincaid's past? And what would happen when the truth finally came out? The tension in the mansion grew unbearable as the days stretched on. Samantha had expected the final moments of Mr. Kincaid's life to be filled with a kind of quiet resignation. But instead, she was thrust into a world of unresolved conflicts, past sins, and impending retribution. Jonathan Crane's shadow loomed over them both, and with each passing hour, Samantha felt herself sinking deeper into a storm she hadn't prepared for. It was no longer just about fulfilling a simple request. It had become a battle of wills, a race against time where every decision seemed to carry an unbearable weight. Samantha found herself in the sitting room one evening, staring out of the large bay window that overlooked the estate. The darkened grounds seemed to stretch endlessly before her, a reminder of just how isolated she had become in this strange, twisted world. Her thoughts were racing, but she couldn't seem to focus on any one thing. Her mind kept returning to Mr. Kincaid's words, his admission that the past could never be outrun, that there were debts that no amount of wealth could settle. And now, with Crane's return, those debts were coming due in ways she couldn't even begin to understand. A soft knock on the door broke her reverie. She turned to see Mr. Kincaid standing in the doorway, his frail frame almost invisible in the shadows. He looked worse than he had the day before, his face pale, his eyes sunken, his movements slow and labored. Samantha couldn't help but feel a wave of sympathy for him. But at the same time, she knew that what was happening here wasn't just about a man dying alone. It was about the price of choices made long ago, and the consequences that were now unavoidable. "May I come in?" Mr. Kincaid asked, his voice thin and strained. Samantha nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He walked slowly toward the armchair by the fireplace and sank into it, letting out a soft sigh. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire, the warmth from it not quite enough to dispel the chill in the air. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "about the choice you'll have to make soon." Samantha raised an eyebrow, unsure of what he meant. "What choice?" Mr. Kincaid turned his head slightly, his eyes locking with hers. There was a kind of intensity in his gaze that unnerved her, a recognition that somehow she was now a part of something much larger than herself. "The choice of whether to stay or leave, whether to walk away from all of this and return to your life, or become part of my legacy." Samantha's stomach tightened. "Your legacy?" she repeated. She had no idea what he was talking about, but the words filled her with dread. What kind of legacy could a man like Mr. Kincaid leave behind, especially one built on such betrayal and regret? He nodded slowly. "I've spent my life building an empire. Wealth, influence, power. But when it's all gone, when the money means nothing, what remains? Only the choices I made, the people I hurt. And now—" He paused, his voice breaking as he continued. "Now I'm paying the price. But you have an opportunity, Samantha. You've been here for me, in ways that no one else has. And I know what I'm about to ask isn't fair, but I need you to understand that this is about more than just me." Samantha felt her chest tighten as she tried to piece together what he was saying. "What do you need from me?" she asked cautiously. He met her gaze with a quiet intensity. "I need you to stay, not just as my wife for a day, but as someone who will help me right the wrongs I've done. You've seen what Crane has come for. But there's more to it, Samantha. I've made enemies, powerful enemies, and if I die without settling things, they'll come after you, after your family." Samantha froze. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had come here to do a kindness, to help a man who seemed lost and desperate. She never imagined she'd be drawn into something so dangerous. "You're asking me to—" "What?" "To become part of this mess. To put my life on the line for a man who betrayed his closest friend, destroyed families, and now wants redemption." Her voice wavered with disbelief. "I didn't ask for this, Mr. Kincaid. I came here to help you, but this isn't what I signed up for." Mr. Kincaid's expression softened, and for a moment, he seemed like a man who had already lost everything, except, perhaps, his final chance at redemption. "I know it's not what you signed up for," he said quietly, "but it's the truth. Crane won't stop, and when I die, he'll be after what's mine. But it's not just him. The people I've crossed will come after you too." Samantha shook her head, her mind spinning. She had never asked for this kind of responsibility. She had never asked to become embroiled in a billionaire's fight with his past, to bear the consequences of decisions she hadn't made. But as she looked at Mr. Kincaid, she realized that he was right. This wasn't just about him anymore. His actions had rippled outward, touching everyone around him, even her. "You want me to stay and protect your wealth?" she asked, her voice thick with incredulity. "You want me to be your shield?" "I need someone I can trust," he said quietly. "And I know I've asked a lot of you already, but you're the only person I can trust now. My enemies have already made their moves. Crane is only the beginning." Samantha felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She couldn't just walk away. She couldn't leave her family behind and return to the life she had before. She had come here to help, to offer comfort to a man in his final days. But now she was faced with a choice that was far more complicated: to stay and risk her own safety, to fight against enemies she didn't even know existed, or to walk away and live with the knowledge that she had abandoned someone in their final moments. There was no easy answer. "I need to think about this," she said finally, standing up and pacing toward the window. Her mind was racing, but nothing made sense anymore. The man she had thought she understood had revealed a side to himself she wasn't prepared for, a side that had come at the cost of others' lives, and now, perhaps her own. What was she willing to risk? What was she willing to lose? Mr. Kincaid watched her silently, his eyes filled with both desperation and gratitude. "I understand. But time is running out, Samantha. I don't know how much longer I have." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air, and Samantha knew that she was at a crossroads. Her decision could change the course of everything, from her life to Mr. Kincaid's legacy, to the future she had hoped for. It was a decision that would not only shape her own fate, but also the fate of those she loved. As she turned back toward him, her heart was heavy with the burden of the choices she would soon have to make. She had come here for one reason: to help. But now she faced a decision far beyond what she had ever imagined, a decision that would define the rest of her life. Would she stay and fight for a man who had long ago lost his way, or would she leave everything behind and start anew? The clock was ticking, and the cost of both choices was higher than she had ever dreamed. The days passed in a haze, with each one blending into the next, each moment pulling Samantha further into a vortex of uncertainty. The choice that Mr. Kincaid had laid before her hung over her like a storm cloud, and she knew it was only a matter of time before she would have to make it. It wasn't just about staying or leaving. It was about choosing between the safety of her family and stepping into a world of danger that she had never imagined. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and security, now felt like a trap. Every room, every hallway, every shadow seemed to whisper with secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Samantha's mind was racing. She had no idea what kind of enemies Mr. Kincaid had made over the years. She didn't know how far his actions had reached, nor how deeply his betrayals had cut. But one thing was clear: Crane wasn't the only one who wanted something from him. His empire, built on power and deceit, had attracted enemies in places Samantha couldn't even begin to comprehend. The longer she stayed, the more she felt herself becoming entangled in a web that she couldn't escape. Her thoughts often wandered to her family, her children, her home, the simple life she had built, the life she had chosen for them, away from the complications and chaos of the world of the rich and powerful. It was that life she wanted to return to, but every time she thought about walking away, the weight of her decision pulled her back. Was it possible to leave Mr. Kincaid to face his fate alone? Could she live with the guilt of abandoning him, especially after everything he had shared with her? The truth was, she wasn't sure. Late one night, as she sat alone in the library, the sound of footsteps in the hallway startled her. She looked up to see Mr. Kincaid standing in the doorway, his eyes tired but sharp, the weight of his sickness visible in the lines of his face. He had been growing weaker with each passing day, but his mind was still as alert as ever. "You've been quiet lately," he said softly, his voice a mere rasp. "Have you made your decision?" Samantha felt her stomach churn. She hadn't been avoiding him, but every conversation they had seemed to dig deeper into her dilemma. "I haven't had the chance to think about anything else, honestly," she replied. "Every time I try, I get lost in my own thoughts." Kincaid's eyes softened, and for a moment, he seemed more like the man she had first met, the quiet, distant billionaire who had only wanted someone to stand by him. But there was no ignoring the shadows in his eyes now, the weight of the choices he had made that had brought them both to this point. "I understand," he said, taking a few steps into the room. "This wasn't the way I wanted things to go. You didn't sign up for this. But I need you to know something. There are consequences for everything. For the decisions I made, and for the choices you will make." Samantha looked up at him, her heart pounding. "You talk about consequences as if there's something I can just ignore. I have a family, Mr. Kincaid. I have people who depend on me. I can't just throw that away." "I know," he whispered, "but you're not just walking away from me. You're walking away from the future, from what could be. You have the power to change the outcome. You're not just a part of this because I've asked it of you. You've been a part of this all along. You've given me something that no one else could. A chance. A second chance at something real." Samantha's eyes stung with unshed tears. She had never expected to find herself so deeply connected to a man like Mr. Kincaid. She had only agreed to help him, to offer him a fleeting sense of comfort in his last days. But now, everything felt different. She wasn't sure what had happened, whether it was his vulnerability, or the way he had opened up to her, or the way she had come to understand the depths of his regrets. But something inside her had shifted. "You don't need me to stay," she said, her voice trembling. "You need to make peace with your past, with what you've done. And I can't fix that. I can't change anything for you. But you can change everything for yourself," Kincaid replied, his voice gaining strength. "You can choose to be part of the solution. You can choose to rise above it all." Samantha stood up, her heart racing. "I don't know what that even means, Mr. Kincaid. You're asking me to risk everything. My family, my future. For what? To protect your wealth. Your empire." He met her gaze without flinching. "I'm asking you to protect what's left of me. And I'm asking you to protect the future. For your family, for your children. There's more at stake here than just money or power. I've made mistakes that can't be undone, but you have the chance to stop them from consuming you. You don't have to be part of the world I built, but you can be part of something new." Samantha felt her chest tighten. The weight of his words was overwhelming, but they also sparked something deep inside her. She had always prided herself on being strong, on making choices for her family, on protecting them from the kind of chaos that had ensnared Mr. Kincaid. But now, she was staring at a future where she had the power to change everything. She could walk away, or she could stand with him. She could protect her family, or she could protect a man who had nothing left to lose. She took a deep breath, the decision forming in her mind. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. Kincaid's face softened, and for the first time in a long while, a faint smile crossed his lips. "You don't need to do anything, Samantha. You've already done more than I could ever ask for. You've given me something no one else could. Humanity. A chance to be seen, to be understood. And that's all I ever wanted." Samantha looked at him, her heart heavy but resolute. "Then I'll stay. I'll stand by you." The words felt like a promise, and yet they also felt like the beginning of something much bigger than either of them had anticipated. As the days drew to a close, Samantha knew that her life had already been irrevocably changed. The future that awaited her was uncertain, But one thing was clear. She wasn't going to walk away. Not from Mr. Kincaid. Not from the legacy he had left behind. And as the final chapter of his life drew to a close, Samantha found herself standing at the crossroads of two worlds. The one she had left behind, and the one she was about to enter. She wasn't sure what lay ahead, but she knew that whatever happened next, she would face it with the strength she had always carried deep within her.